This whole part of the center north of America, consisting of Montana, the Dakotas, Wyoming, and parts of Nebraska and Idaho, is by far the emptiest, most sparsely populated region of the continental 48 US states. North and South Dakota combined equals the population of Manhattan, while Montana, Wyoming, Nebraska, and Idaho all combined equals the populations of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, combined without even factoring in the additional population of the Bronx. New York City alone thus has a population larger than all 6 of these geographically large states do combined, with more than 1 million people left over to spare. But what's perhaps the strangest part about how empty this part of the middle of Northern America is that immediately across the border further north into Canada, where you'd expect the climate to be even harsher and colder and the population to be even smaller, it's actually dramatically larger and a lot more densely populated instead. Alberta's population is nearing 4.7 million people today, nearly as much as all of Montana, both of the Dakotas, Wyoming and Idaho all combined, which further makes Alberta more than twice as densely populated as Montana is, despite both of them being interior landlocked regions and Alberta being much higher north in latitude. Alberta's also got dramatically larger cities than any of the US states do further to its south, such as Calgary and Edmonton, which are genuinely big metropolitan regions with populations of 1.64 million and 1.54 million people, respectively. Alone has about the same amount of residents as North and South Dakota do combined, despite being located way further north and remaining inland, while Edmonton has many more people than the entirety of Montana combined. Despite being located way further north, more than 300 miles further beyond the Montana border, Edmonton is thus the furthest north city in the Americas with a metropolitan population of more than 1 million people. But it and Calgary aren't even the only very big cities that can be found north of the most empty part of the continental 48 US states. There's also Winnipeg in Manitoba with a population of about 840,000 people, which dwarfs any of the American settlements further south in the Dakotas or Montana, and is far more people than live in the entirety of North Dakota combined. And then there's also Saskatoon and Regina in Saskatchewan with 342,000 and 250,000 residents respectively. Saskatoon is bigger than any other city in Montana, the Dakotas or Wyoming, while even Regina with its 250,000 people is big in comparison to Montana and North Dakota standards. Further to the south, seeing the big picture, the top 5 biggest Canadian cities in the internal Canadian prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan and Manitoba are vastly larger than the top 5 biggest American cities are further south, in internal Montana, the Dakotas and Wyoming. The reasons why the settlement patterns developed in this seemingly counterintuitive way here in the North American interior are incredibly complex and fascinating. South of the US-Canada border, there are many reasons why Montana, the Dakotas, and Wyoming became the emptiest part of the lower continental 48 states. It is an area that is almost entirely west of the 98th meridian line of longitude, the imaginary geographic line that roughly divides the wet and humid environment of the North American continent in the east from the dry and arid environment found in the west. Nearly anywhere east of this line in the United States, farms can rely more on natural rainfall and less on artificial irrigation, which means that, in a broad sense, food can be produced more cheaply and in greater quantities that can sustain larger population bases. At the very frontier of where this line cuts across the continent and divides the wet east from the arid west, you can find a nearly perfect trail of frontier cities straddling the divide immediately before everything becomes arid, like San Antonio, Austin, Fort Worth, Oklahoma City, Wichita, Omaha, and the aforementioned Sioux Falls and Fargo in the Dakotas and Winnipeg further north into Canada. East of this line in these frontier cities is the overwhelming 80% of the entire American population, and west of it is the remaining 20% scattered across only islands of dense populations in between vast and largely empty distances in places like Denver, Albuquerque, El Paso, Salt Lake City, Boise, Tucson, Phoenix, Las Vegas, and the heavily populated but narrow US West Coast. This is the result of numerous geographic and climatic factors all working together to shape where people are actually able to live in the North American continent. The gigantic western mountain ranges, comprising the coast Cascades, Rockies, and Sierra Nevada, cleave off only a narrow strip of coastal plains and valleys in the western sections of California, Oregon, and Washington that are more or less directly exposed to the incoming winds and moisture blowing in from the Pacific Ocean. When those moisture-rich Pacific winds impact the towering mountain ranges, though, they release most of their moisture as precipitation on the westward-facing windward side before they reach over the mountains and blow down on the leeward side without that moisture as dry winds. This is why the western halves of Washington and Oregon, exposed to the Pacific, receive so much more rainfall than their eastern halves do on the opposite side of the mountains. And it's why the cities in the west of the states like Seattle, Tacoma, and Portland were able to sustain more agriculture and support larger numbers of people than the cities over on the leeward side of the mountains where the environment is a lot drier, like Spokane, Yakima, or Bend. The eastern half of the United States, to the east of the 98th meridian, receives moisture-rich winds blowing in from the Gulf of Mexico and from the Atlantic, but the moisture they carry usually fails to penetrate into the continental interior any further beyond the 98th meridian, which is why everything between the 98th meridian in the east and the coast, Cascade, Rocky, and Sierra Nevada mountain ranges in the west is so dry and not great for agriculture without extensive irrigation practices. Montana and Wyoming, along with a vast majority of Idaho, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Nebraska, fall precisely within this range of the United States where it's already very dry. And then on top of that, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming all have large stretches of their territories that are dominated by the Rocky Mountains, which complicates their abilities to develop large urban areas even further. And then even beyond the Rockies in the eastern parts of Montana and Wyoming and within the entirety of the Dakotas and Nebraska, the lack of big trees, hills, all mountains and the vast expanse of mostly flat plains and prairie means that the dry winds blowing through here don't have very much friction to slow them down, and consequently it's also one of the windiest locations that can be found anywhere on the planet as well. So basically, the environments in this part of the United States are dry, arid, rugged, cold, and very windy. And beyond the significant boom in North Dakota, where large amounts of shale oil was discovered and capitalized on only recently, since the 2010s, no very large amounts of resource wealth have been discovered or capitalized on within these American states either, which is why historically they were never as extensively developed as other more ideal settlement locations within the United States were first, and why they largely remain sparsely populated to this day. But further to the north, right across the border in Canada, the historic, geographic, biological, and geological factors have all been just different enough to make it a much more densely populated region than either Montana or the Dakotas today. You see, when the first European colonists began coming into and settling the modern-day lands of Canada hundreds of years ago, they experienced several geographic realities that determined where they were able to settle that continues to directly impact where all 38 million Canadians live today. Perhaps the single most important geographic feature of Canada that's determined where Canadians have lived for centuries is the Canadian Shield, a vast expansive area that covers nearly half of the country and which constitutes the largest mass of exposed Precambrian rock that can be found anywhere on the planet. Across the Pleistocene epoch from about 2.6 million years ago to only about 12,000 years ago, the Shield was the center of the vast North American continental glaciers that slowly, over 2.5 million years of time, advanced ever southward and scraped all of the land across it bare of its overlying soils and minerals, which were mostly pushed to the south and southwest of the Shield. As a result, the land across the Shield today consists mostly of exposed jagged bedrock with, at best, only a very thin layer of topsoil above it, which makes it all largely useless to carry out any large-scale agriculture on. The landscape is riddled with lakes and rivers, and building any infrastructure across it is prohibitively expensive because mostly everything has to be drilled and blasted into the exposed rock. The Shield does have valuable mineral wealth though. So it is still useful, but because building and sustaining settlements within it is so challenging, the largest settlement that can be found anywhere across it today is the mining town of Sudbury in Ontario, and it only has a population of 166. 0 people. When you overlay a map of the Canadian Shield with Canada's modern population density, you obviously see that it's about a perfect match, with nearly all Canadians today living beyond it. So when the first European settlers came to colonize Canada, they obviously encountered the challenging to settle Shield as well, and so they concentrated around the very strategic St. Lawrence River region, which historically was navigable by ships from the Atlantic Ocean as far inland as precisely where Montreal is today, where a series of rapids exist that impair navigation any deeper into the North American continent. For centuries, for all of that time, then, Montreal was the deepest internal city in the northeast of the Americas with a navigable link directly to the global ocean, which is why Montreal evolved into Canada's largest city for centuries until the 1980s, when it was finally surpassed by Toronto. A large part of which had to do with the development and final opening of the St. Lawrence Seaway project in 1959, a series of locks and canals across the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes that artificially overcame geography and finally opened up all of the Great Lakes to navigable access to the greater ocean around the rapids due west of Montreal, which transformed interior cities like Toronto, Detroit, Chicago, and even cities as deep into the interior like Duluth, Minnesota, into truly maritime port cities with direct access to the ocean. Before that became possible in 1959, though, Canadian settlement was crammed in around the navigable section of the St. Lawrence River between the impossible-to-settle Canadian Shield in the north and the Great Lakes and Appalachian Mountains to the south, which eventually coalesced into the United States. The large bodies of water in the form of the Great Lakes here also help to absorb and radiate heat around them, which moderates the climate around them and keeps the region more temperate than they otherwise would be. The Aspen Parkland region stretches out in the center between these two biomes in a narrow band, no wider than 150 to 300 miles, extending from almost immediately where the Canadian Shield ends in western Manitoba before arcing northwards through central Saskatchewan and then on into central Alberta. Simply put, the agricultural potential and output of these more northern Canadian provinces is vastly higher than the American states further to the south like Montana, the Dakotas and Wyoming. Within only a single decade from the discovery of Leduc No. 1, the populations of Calgary and Edmonton roughly doubled, while the population growth rate of Alberta as a whole has been consistently in the double-digit percentages every single decade ever since. The vast majority of the oil production in Alberta has always been sold and exported through these pipelines down to the US market, and the Albertans managed to sell so much of it to the Americans that Canada has risen to account for more than half of America's total petroleum imports now as of 2022. And again, the courses are legitimately well designed so that you're actually engaged the whole way through and you actually learn stuff along the way, since they break really big concepts down into their intuitive based principles and then bring them back together again progressively as you go,